Sir, the possibility of successfully navigating an asteroid field is approximately 3,720 to 1.
Never tell me the odds.
Hello, this is No, and I believe that if you take cranberries and stew them like applesauce, they taste much more like prunes than rhubarb does. Welcome to the After Effects Kickstart podcast.
Hello, motion graphics warriors. Welcome back to the After Effects Kickstart podcast. Today, Joey and I will be discussing the history of motion graphics Part 2, focusing on the period from 2001 to 2004. I call this period an industry in transition, because really everything's changing. For the first time, people actually seem to know what motion graphics is and how to best use it, okay? And some of the people who would later on become big players in the industry are already starting to make their voices and their visions clear with some of their first major pieces. Even more, today we have our first, what I'm calling our first grandmother piece, which I'll get into more in the podcast and you'll see what I'm talking about. So the 4 videos we're going to be discussing today are the 6 Feet Under titles by Danny Yount, the Finn movie by G-Monk, the Catch Me If You Can titles by Kunzel and Degas, and the Take Me Out music video by Jonas Odell for the group Franz Ferdinand. Before we get into the discussion, I think it would be really helpful if you were to pause this and watch all 4 of these videos first. Joey and I are going to go into great detail about these pieces, and in fact, even into some like specific moments and talk about some like specific effects that were used and stuff. So it's a pretty granular discussion. And unless you've watched the pieces recently, I'm going to say you're just going to miss a little bit here. So watch them first if you have the opportunity, and let's jump in and join the discussion. All right, we're back with Joey Kornman. How you doing today, Joey?
I am doing excellent, Noel, and it is a pleasure to be back here talking about MoGraph.
As always, Joey and I can never stop talking about MoGraph, so this is a great opportunity for us to yammer on at length. Today we're going to be looking at 4 really awesome pieces, and I think you guys will really like this. We're going to start with the 6 Feet Under title sequence, which came out in 2001. It was a product of Digital Kitchen and was directed by Danny Yount, I think is how you pronounce the name. It might be Yount, I'm not really sure. But this is actually a really important piece because, in my estimation, this is kind of the first TV show titles that were elevated to the level of a movie title sequence. I think before this, most shows just had pretty lousy, not really well thought out, not really well designed titles that basically just list the names of the stars, and that's about it. And then it was just not a design priority, and it was not a prestige thing. But after this, every show that wanted to be good had to have a prestige title sequence. So I think that's a pretty important moment in MoGraph history.
I would agree 100%. And I was trying to think back to other title sequences that were around during this era. And the one that came to mind, I don't know if you ever watched this show, was the title sequence to ER, which I think was pretty typical, where it was like just sort of the corny, like, the actor spins around and it's slow motion with like some kind of sapphire effect thrown over the whole thing to make it bloom and glow. And then like the name would sort of like slam down or something. And 6 Feet Under was so restrained.
Yes.
And really thought out in like a visual metaphor sort of way, and the music. And I think you nailed it. I mean, it really, it didn't look like anything else that was out there, and it looked like the beginning to a big budget feature film. So it totally changed the game in terms of the creative aesthetic, for sure.
Yeah, you guys should Google the ER titles. I did the same thing, and I think Danny Yount references it in the Art of the Titles webpage about this piece, and it was shocking to me how bad well, I shouldn't say bad, but just how of its time it looked, and how it kind of brought me back to that time. This also won an Emmy for Outstanding Main Titles in 2002, so I think the industry pretty quickly recognized the difference between what had come before and this. And I just want to say, about the design, I mean, you used the word restrained. I mean, I completely agree with that. This is just perfect, I feel like, from a design standpoint. Like in the ER titles, every title is just smack dab in the center, and it's of a certain height, and a certain size. And this, I mean, everything fits perfectly into the shots. It's, clearly been storyboarded and composed to be exactly like this, and then shot to be like this. I mean, all the type is perfectly placed, and all the photography is brilliant, and the music suits it really well. So it's definitely a perfect storm. I thought it was interesting as well that in that same interview in Art of the Titles, Danny Yount said that he was definitely influenced by Kyle Cooper and the Seven titles when he made this. And I think you can really see that, especially in the uses of the close-ups, especially that one where it's the close-up of the sort of corpse and the eye is open and there's like a little cotton swab going above the eyebrow. To me, that was just like the perfect update for the Seven. It was like not the creepy, grungy Nine Inch Nails thing, but it was the same exact idea, sort of getting into the head of an undertaker and seeing what their life would be like, So I think that's just really excellent design.
Yeah. So one of the things that we used to talk about a lot when I taught at Ringling was the idea that a motion designer has, quite a few tools at their disposal to create images that communicate something. And when you're learning After Effects, everyone listening is taking an After Effects class. It's easy to forget that you have tools such as photography. And one of the things I really love about this title sequence is the graphic nature of the photography. If you need to go out and shoot, feet with a toe tag on it, there's many different ways to frame that, and there's different things. You could have the cover all the way off of the body, or just covering the top half, and every single framing and every single shot of this sequence is so precisely crafted. And sometimes you may not think of that as motion design, but I do. And I think that's kind of one of the lessons I would suggest the students take away from this is even when you know After Effects inside and out and you've got all these chops and you can composite and animate and design, don't forget, you can also go out with a camera and in a much shorter amount of time get the perfect thing that's then going to elevate your motion design to the next level. There's so many shots where it's just a piece of footage and some white type, and it's way more beautiful than something that has 200 layers and all kinds of expressions and stuff in it. So this is kind of a recurring theme. I think we talked about it in the last episode, that design and concept typically are far more important than the amount of animation in a piece.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And let's just talk about the concept here for a second. So this is about a family of undertakers. And so every image in this relates to death or decomposition in some way, okay? And if you watch, so there are two versions of this piece, actually. There's a director's cut that's a little bit more animated and has some different shots, and then there's the one that aired. And especially the director's cut, they've actually brought that idea of decomposition down into the way that the titles animate and animate off screen. They kind of decompose or turn into smoke or kind of disintegrate. And it matches the concept perfectly, as do like the time-lapse shots of the flowers decaying and that kind of work, but actually, and maybe Joey wants to talk about this, that disintegration was not very easy to do, I don't think. So maybe we could jump in and talk about that technically for a second.
Sure. So in the director's cut, when the type is sort of towards the end, this starts to happen. The type will come on to have, the director of photography's name or an actor's name or something, and the type starts to dissolve. And when this piece came out, there was no YouTube, that no one just knew how to do that. And the plugin that everyone uses now for stuff like that is Trapped Code Particular. Which is a fairly easy to use particle system you can buy for After Effects. But at the time it didn't exist, and there was a built-in particle effect called Particle Playground, which I believe might actually still be in After Effects, but but now another one ships. I think Particle World also ships with After Effects. It's a lot easier to use. Particle Playground was really difficult to use, and I only used it a couple of times, and it was very tough to figure out. But that's what they used on this, and they probably would have had to do a ton of manual masking and create a layer that's going to just be little bits of particles, and then slowly dissolve that on and mask out the piece of the type that's supposed to be blowing away, and probably layering lots of other effects to get it to look just right. And now there's probably like a preset for that you can just go get, or it ships with particular. But back then, all of those effects had to be built by hand. So even the littlest things like that, motion designers at the time, and we didn't call ourselves motion designers, we were MoGraphers or MoGraph artists. We would latch on to little things like that and be like, how'd they do that? And there was no art of the title. There was no YouTube. So I remember seeing that and trying to reverse engineer it. And it was a lot harder back then than it is now, for sure.
Right. I'm still not even sure, even with that excellent description, that I understand how they mapped, maybe this is too technical, but how they mapped the particle system onto the type and had it take on the shape of various pieces of the type. You think that was like a masking thing, but then how does masking work with a particle system?
Right. So typically the way it works, and I haven't used Particle Playground in a while, but the way it typically works in a particle system is you have an emitter, right? So you have something that creates the particles, and that thing can be a point in space, or it could be kind of a volume, like the particles kind of are born within a certain area, or you can use a layer as an emitter. Right. So if you have a layer with an alpha channel, like, an E from like from a font that you've kind of pre-comped this E, particles can emit from that E. Right. And maybe you mask off just the top of that E. And so particles are emitting just from the top of the E. And as they're emitting, you're also wiping away the E. Right. So you have the emitter, which you can't see. It's invisible, but it is in the shape of that E. So particles are kind of coming off of the E. And at the same time, you're making the actual E disappear. And it's this sleight of hand that makes it look like the E is disintegrating. It's not actually disintegrating. It just fools you. And a lot of motion graphics, effects, that's how it works. When you watch it in real time, it looks like the letters are dissolving. Well, actually, if you go frame by frame, you'll see there are particles and the letter is dissolving at the same time. And when you put those two together and you don't know what the trick is, it looks like the letters are dissolving. I've had to do this exact technique on a job for HBO before. And it literally was just like 6 or 7 layers of particles and mats and just getting the timing just right so that the layer wipes away right as these particles happen. And you do it with the right timing and it fools everybody.
Right. So it's not just doing it by brute force, by just breaking off tiny little pieces, but it's almost as difficult as that, basically.
Yeah, and there probably was some of that too, because if you're using a particle system, you're giving up some of that control. You can't,
right.
You can't, if there's 100 particles, you're not going to art direct every single one. But if there's like one big piece that you kind of want to just drift slower than the rest, you can just hand animate that. I would imagine that they kind of threw the kitchen sink at this thing to get that effect.
Yeah. I know that he said in the interview that they did the color correct in After Effects, which was pretty unusual at that time, especially for something at this level, I think. So that's interesting that they had already started to integrate that. And maybe he felt like he just had more hands-on control than taking it to, some sort of higher end online room or Flame or something to do the color correct. I'm not sure why they did that at the time, but I think it was pretty cool, and it shows where we were at too in the industry at that moment.
Well, here's my theory why they would do it that way. This is an issue that always pops up when you have to put white type on a piece of footage. Is you can't read it because you have to control the value very, very carefully when you're doing that, right? If you have footage of a blue sky with clouds, right? There's a shot, where you see clouds, you see the blue sky, and the type is nestled right between these clouds just perfectly. And I'm sure that the original photography was far too bright for that. However, you're going to want some parts of that shot to be bright and others to not be bright, others to be, have the blacks pretty crushed so that white type will pop. And if you do it the traditional way, which is you kind of mock things up and then you do a traditional color correction session where you take the 35 millimeter film to some really expensive place and a colorist sits there and makes it just perfect, but you're not seeing it in context with the titles on top of it typically, right? It's different now. Now you can do color correction on a DaVinci and have the titles right on top and see everything in context. At the time, you couldn't do that. And they probably realized, well, these titles depend, like the legibility depends on this color correction. And if we do it in After Effects, we actually can vignette certain areas and brighten certain areas just enough and darken certain areas just enough and shape that frame exactly the way we want and see it in context. So the design will be exactly the way we want, and we won't have to hope that the color correct gives us what we need so that we can read the titles. So it's a control thing, and you're right, though. It was a little strange to do it that way at that time.
Right. Well, they did a few things strangely at the time on this sequence, I think, as well. And I think it's a real testament to Danny Yount's vision. Actually, the photography of this, they had a lot of difficulties. And I think in part because this was so perfectly storyboarded first, and then they tried to match very, very specific storyboard moments in photography, which doesn't always work out exactly the way you think when you're storyboarding. For example, the famous shot of the tree on the hill at the end, like they found the right location, but it was winter and they couldn't find a tree with leaves, so they had to like import a tree, and then so they basically had to like bury it in the ground the right way, but then it started to fall over, so they had to hold it up with ropes to get that shot. So, also, they wanted the shot of the crow, but you're not allowed to film crows for whatever reason, so they had to like take a different bird, like a raven or something. And
right.
There was all these little considerations that, something that works on the storyboard and then getting that into photography and getting that in the can is actually really difficult. And this is a testament to how good this team was.
I agree. This one holds up for sure.
Oh, and just as a note, 4 people did this in 4 weeks. That's what they said. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
We hate hearing that.
Yeah, it is. Danny Yount, and I don't know if that's how you pronounce it either. We probably should have researched that. But anyone listening who hasn't heard that name, right up there with Kyle Cooper. That's one of the greats in title design.
Oh yeah, he's done Iron Man, Sherlock Holmes, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. He did recently the American Horror Story titles. I mean, he's a major player, and so at the early stages of the history of MoGraph, people like this are starting to come into their own already. And actually, if we transition into the next piece now, which is talking about the Finn movie by G-Monk, I think you have a similar situation where somebody who's going to become a major player in motion graphics is just starting out, but really just already really putting their voice out into the world. And I mean, so this is 2002, and G-Monk had been out of school, I think, for 2 years. He went to Humboldt State, and let's just say that in another 2 years, he directed and designed the Terminator 3 movie title sequence for Kyle Cooper's company, right? So this is obviously a man in great ascendancy and a huge talent. And I know he's a favorite of Joey's as well. So
I am a G-Monk fanboy, and I wear that fanboy ness on my sleeve, I guess. And it was really fun to go back and watch this piece, because I saw this a long time ago before I really became a G-Monk fanatic. And watching it kind of feels G-Monky. Like even then he kind of had this distinct, I don't know, it's kind of weird to talk about something this strange and say, oh, you can hear his voice in it, but you kind of can, and I kind of want to get into what the hell that means, because when you look at a lot of his newer stuff, there's still sort of this weird this thing about it where he looks at the world in a different way than most people do, and he's not afraid to put that into his work, which as someone who's doing very big commercial art, it's pretty tough to kind of thread the needle the way he has.
That's true. That's really true. I mean, he himself said that this piece illustrates, quote, why a sweet little girl should never take LSD. And, just not having met him, but following his career, I feel like he probably took a little bit of LSD at certain times too, to get the sort of unique vision that he has on the world. But I think if we break that down, what it is that his work is like, I think part of what it is it's very sci-fi, and I think it's definitely kind of glitchy and sci-fi, and I feel like he was a real early, he's reaching for, even in this piece, UI design, even back then, what would become this kind of big thing, and even something that he would be kind of known for. I feel like you're seeing a lot of that, in a proto-development stage here in this piece. I mean, he's really trying to illustrate what's going on inside this girl's head through graphics, which I think is actually interesting, that and it bears a relationship to what we talked about with 7 titles as well, which is the designer director trying to get into the mind of the subject and then design the piece as if that person, it was directly coming from their mind. In this case, it's a confused little girl who's being represented almost in a robotic sci-fi way, and not a psychopathic murderer who wants to kill people. But I feel as an intention, that's a similarity between both those pieces.
Yeah, he seems to be, I've heard a lot of interviews with him, and he seems to be fascinated with perception in general. And this is one of the things that I love about this piece is that you take on the surface this really simple premise. A little girl is lost, or she's by herself in the city, and everything's freaking her out because there's this big city with buses and noises and strangers and things like that. Right. And, you think if you hired J.J. Abrams to shoot a short film about that, it would not look anything like this, right? I mean, like, if you had David Fincher do it, then it would be totally different. And so G-Monk, he's got a different set of tools than those two directors, but he's already starting to kind of find his voice. And you mentioned LSD. I don't think that was his drug of choice. I think it was probably like mushrooms and ayahuasca and a lot of other things. But that's something interesting to bring up because motion design, motion graphics, it's a much newer artistic field. But it still has a lot of the hallmarks of, drug use. And you've got these trailblazers, these psychonauts out there, like, unabashedly talking about using, chemicals and plants and things like that to get these unique visions. And G-Monk, more than anybody else, I think, maybe Albert Omas is another example of someone who's talked very publicly about this. They take these trips, I guess, for lack of a better word, and then they try to get that image onto the screen. And G-Monk just has a knack for it. And a lot of his work has this weird, creepy, otherworldly quality to it. And it's amazing that, when did this piece come out? 2002. Mm-hmm. He was able to pull that off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And takes some, cojones, I think, to put that out there as well, So I think that's really hats off to him. And I think it also might be kind of where he was in the world, kind of Northern California at the time, Seattle. I think it might have been a little bit more relaxed about that than New York City and Boston, where Joey and I were working. I don't know, but, I still think it's amazing that this is one of his earliest pieces and that his vision is so fully formed here. The only thing I don't love about this piece, I got to say, looking at it, is the color palette. It's a little muddy, but that's about the only thing I could see. I mean, I think nowadays he's doing a lot more sophisticated work along these same lines, but this, all the 3D layers and all the angled stuff and all those kind of fast cuts and that kind of, I don't think he did the audio on this, or do you know anything about that? Because it matches so perfectly.
Yeah, I don't know if he did the audio on it, but everything he does, the audio is always amazing, which at least tells me that he's thinking about it, at a very high level. It's not an afterthought for him. As far as like the production on this, I mean, I'm assuming that the camera that shot this footage was not. So, in 2002, I mean, unless you had $100,000 lying around, you probably weren't even shooting in HD, and which it's hard to imagine. So, like the quality probably just was as good as you could get. You can also see the design was not nearly as sophisticated as what he's doing now. And the truth is, G-Monk now, the G-Monk that we all know about, is not G-Monk. It's not like one dude, right? When G-Monk does something now, there's a whole like crew on it, right. and he's at the point where he can cherry pick the best designers, the best 3D artists in the world to execute his vision. So I mean, this I'm sure was just him and like After Effects, but it's cool. So even like the design isn't quite as polished as what we're used to seeing, the vision is still there. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the effects in this because. Yeah. It's 2002. There's no graph editor. Yeah, G-Monk isn't really known for doing like smooth, buttery animation. That's kind of not his thing anyway.
Right.
But there's just a lot of glitchy, weird stuff. And there's this one effect that happens, 20, 30 times throughout the piece where these pixels kind of stretch and smear. And it's similar to what we saw in the softcore sweater porn that MK12 did, right?
That's right. You're right.
Now, they may have done it the same way G-Monk did, but at the time, there were two plugins that could do this. One was called Raybeam, and I never used that one, and I Googled, I couldn't even find any mention of it anymore. Okay. I know it existed because I remember it, but I never got to use it. But there was another plugin, and it was called Smear. and it was written by this guy, Pete Warden, who you can still go find his website. I think it's petewarden.com. And he made this suite of plugins called Pete's Plugins, and they were free. And everybody used them because he made these plugins like you could make a kaleidoscope, you could do a halftone effect, you could do this smear effect. These things that all of a sudden became really hot, and we're going to talk about another one of his effects when we talk about the Franz Ferdinand piece. And they were free. And unfortunately, because they were free, he had no incentive to keep developing them. So after, After Effects CS3 or 4 or whatever it was came out, they stopped working and they've never been developed. So nowadays, if you want that effect, AE Scripts sells an effect called Pixel Sorter, which will kind of get you there. It works a little bit differently, but you can get pretty close with it. But it's just interesting because that effect used to be absolutely everywhere.
And we should note that at the time, plugins were very, very expensive, beyond the reach, oftentimes, of one little guy in a shop somewhere. I mean, Sapphire plugins would be thousands of dollars, and you get this huge bundle of stuff, and you really only wanted one or whatever. So people like that guy Pete, who were releasing free plugins, I mean, their influence was so great at the time. I mean, combined with the stylistic influence of G-Monk, really, I mean, I think everybody in motion graphics did a piece that involved that stretchy pixel thing at that time. The other little design trope that's in here that I don't know if he invented, but also became very, very popular, and you saw this for the next 10 years or 5 years or whatever, was the film freezes on the subject, and then they get outlined real quick by a white outline in this case,
right.
And then it moves into a graphic world. And people I feel like Brand New School, they did that a billion times after this, right? I feel like so many people imitated that one exact thing, which was this ability to transition into the graphic world using freeze frames and outlines.
Yeah, I did that plenty of times. I mean, it's a good trick, and it's funny because it really became popular probably 2 or 3 or 4 years later, and it became a lot more sophisticated. And I mean, it's crazy. 2002. It's hard to imagine. I mean, I was still in college. I mean, this thing was not on my radar until a couple of years later. But you're still already sort of seeing a lot of, you're seeing arrows and these, these chevron kind of shapes and,
right.
And the UI elements that kind of were cool for a second and then went away and then came back a decade later, with Ash Thorpe and stuff like that.
Right. And also, he's got a lot of 3D layers going on in here, but I think he must have been using that old lousy 3D tool in After Effects at that time, because I don't think they had the full 3D engine, but you might be able to tell me that better.
So I think this was right on the cusp. So the 3D system really became mature, I think, right at the beginning of 2002. By the way, the code name of After Effects during this time period was Faux Foo. It's not as good as the other ones, Batnip and Nim Chow and Dancing Monkey, but but then in 2007 we get to Metaloaf, which is probably my favorite one.
That's the best one.
But yeah, so there probably were 3D layers at that point. And I remember when I discovered 3D layers, and it looks like G-Monk kind of did the same thing here. You kind of become obsessed with them, and everything needs to have a little camera move kind of orbiting around it so you can see that it's 3D. And he managed to infuse enough design into it and do things quickly enough, cut really quickly, where it didn't kind of feel clunky. But I definitely did a lot of clunky 3D camera moves back in those days.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah.
And so this is 2002 that this is coming out, but at the same exact time, a different, very, very influential piece was coming out in 2002, which is the next piece that we want to talk about, which is this title sequence for the film Catch Me If You Can. It's a film by Steven Spielberg, and the titles were designed and animated by a husband and wife team. I believe they're French, called... I probably also should have researched this, but I'm going to say Kunzel and Degas. I don't know. Is that how you pronounce it, Joey?
That sounds good to me.
And this was a huge deal when this came out. I'm going to call this the first of our grandmother pieces that we're going to talk about in this series, because literally everybody and their grandmother saw this piece and loved it. The advantage being here that if you were working, as I was, in motion graphics in 2002, and you went to a party, or just say right before this piece came out in 2001 or whatever, and you went to a party and you told people, oh yeah, I work in motion design or MoGraph or whatever we called it back then, you would get this blank look like, what do you do? What is it that you do? You put type on screen? I don't get it. That's a job? Like, people just had no idea what I was doing back then. But after this, people really thought they knew what I did. They thought that I did this. Right? Yeah. Or like they had an idea of what motion graphics was. I feel like this just hit the mainstream. I mean, in part because it was a Steven Spielberg movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks or whatever, but also because it was just so darn good at the time. It was so beautifully designed. And again, a perfect storm that works with this beautiful score by John Williams, and really perfectly encapsulates the film and that sort of references the time period of the 60s very well. And obviously, is very influenced by mid-century famous designers like Saul Bass and Paul Rand and those kind of people. But also had like a really cool, at the time, I mean, it seemed very sophisticated technically. I think if you look at it now, a lot of the animation that's done, the sort of obvious After Effects animation, like the moving down of the letter forms and stuff, it looks a little bit crude to us now, but still at the time, it was unbelievable.
Yeah, totally. This piece, for the first probably like 5 years of my career, this was probably the one that clients would show me the most and say, here's reference for what we want you to do. Just like, and it was like almost a cliche, like, they're going to show us Catch Me If You Can titles. And what's interesting about it to me is that when you look at it now, the design and the art direction of it are brilliant, and they still hold up. And frankly, I think it's kind of like the precursor to the modern explainer video aesthetic that we've all seen a million times with flat shapes and just that flat look. And you mentioned the animation, like it. At the time, I remember, there were certain things that in 2002, it's hard to believe, but it was hard to do them. So if you had this line that kind of like went up and then curved over to the right and then curved back up, and you wanted to wipe that line on or off, there was no shape layer yet. So you had to do it with a mask, or you had to create some sort of Luma mat that was bent and warped into the shape. And it was actually fairly tricky. And so I remember seeing this and not even caring about the amazing, like the cool stylized character animation they did or the beautiful design. How'd they make those lines animate on and off? That was kind of like the how the hell they do that thing.
How do you think they made them? I mean, you'd think they just made Illustrator paths and mask them?
So there were a few ways you could do it. Mostly what you do is you would animate the shape of a mask, which was a pain because, you had to almost do it frame by frame at some time. If it needed to turn around a corner and stuff like that, it was really tricky to do. And especially if you then wanted to beat up that mask a little bit so it looked a little rough. If you look at, the transitions on and off here, it's not like a perfectly smooth edge. There's some grit to it. Mm-hmm. So they probably had to make a shape and then create a mask that animated to sort of reveal that shape, and then use maybe roughen edges and some other things to beat that shape up, and then use that as an alpha mat or a Luma mat on the type. It's not nearly as precise. You lose a lot of control when you do that. It's so much easier now with shape layers. I mean, you almost anyone, like by the end of this class, every single person will be able to do it. Yeah, but at the time it was really sophisticated, this piece just, I don't know, like it still holds up. And I think, a lot of studios that make their bones doing explainer videos probably owe Steven Spielberg, Kunzel, and Degas a few beers.
I should say that one of the parts that for me still really holds up is the character animation itself, because they did it in a really unique way. Because I don't know if you guys have seen the film or if it's too old, but like the film involves a character who does a lot of kind of hacking of techniques, like using rubber stamps and cutting things out and what. So they decided to adopt that mindset, and what they did was they made these actual rubber stamps of the characters and each of the limbs, and then somehow they stitched it together into animation, which I think they did actually a pretty good job on that. And what it gave was this really cool variable texture thing going on in the characters that at the time you just really couldn't do that in After Effects. I think nowadays we finally have tools that are, make that a lot easier, like ray dynamic texture and things like that. But back in the day, I wondered about that endlessly, and I never thought, they just rubber stamped it for each frame, which is a kind of a stunt in a way. I mean, that's a lot of work, and they really pulled it off. And I've never seen something explain. I've seen the pictures of the stamps, but I've never seen something explaining. They must have done a ton of tests to get it that good, I feel like.
Yeah, and it is funny how, back then it was still normal to kind of mix analog traditional art school techniques into something like this. And so it probably came natural to them to think of like, oh, well, we want it to kind of feel grungy and cool and different than the rest of the sort of flat environments. So let's use a stamp. And nowadays, probably most people wouldn't think of that. They would think, oh, let's like use Illustrator and get these perfect characters, but then we'll like use a texture kit to kind of like beat it up to make it feel analog. And that's kind of another recurring theme. We're almost actually getting into that era of motion graphics where everybody kind of realized at the same time, hey, it's much cooler and quicker to do this stuff in After Effects, but we still like the way it looks when you do it by hand. So how do we fake that?
Right. And that was, as you said, that was people's training too. And I think when they hit a problem that they couldn't solve digitally, their first thought was, okay, let's start making this by hand, because that's what they had been doing before all this. That's, 10 years ago, that would have been the only thing that they had done. And I think in this case too, just because they were trying to reference the 60s and this idea of things being more handmade, it just really works. But yeah, it is very amazing to me the difference between those animations and the background animation that's going on. And also that a husband and wife team made this together. That's pretty amazing as well. Now that I'm married, I realize that must have been a real pleasure for them, I should say.
Exactly. Yeah, you really you find out what you're made of, and I mean, they're clearly this is inspired by Saul Bass, and so yes. Everything Saul Bass did was essentially made by hand. I mean, and shot practically in a lot of cases, and so maybe it was a conscious decision on their part, like, oh well, we're kind of invoking Saul Bass here. Why don't we, do some of this in a computer, but actually use some kind of real practical elements too, so that it still kind of feels like it, a title sequence that could have been made in the 60s.
Yeah. And I think another thing about this title is that it was one of the first that came out that, I mean, I'm sure it was influenced by Kyle Cooper and Imaginary Forces and Seven titles, but it really felt like a different animal. It felt like somebody finally was kind of establishing a newer design vocabulary than that. And so it kind of really threw down the gauntlet too, I feel like, for me in any case. But, other than that, I just think the only question that I have for you about how some of this was done was the word me in the Catch Me If You Can. It's got this really nice little like blur drift kind of a thing that goes on in there. And I think nowadays that wouldn't be too difficult to animate, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how technically they might have pulled that particular effect off.
Sure. So yeah, right when the title of the movie is revealed, you've got these beautiful lines animating on that say catch if you can. And then the me is kind of a cloud. And that's clearly what they're implying. This little airplane kind of flies by and blows it away. I mean, a lot of times, like when you see stuff like that, I used to try to overcomplicate things, I think, and I would try to, okay, well, maybe they used a particle system to make it cloud-like, and then they would, I would think literally, okay, well, it's a cloud, so it must be particles, and then they're using the wind property on the particle system to blow the particles away, and most of the time, it's way, way simpler than that. Always remember when you're doing things in After Effects, it doesn't matter how you do it as long as it looks right. This is something actually at Ringling I used to get all the time. Students would sort of get caught in this trap of thinking literally, like, if they wanted if they had a 3D object or something and they wanted it to like crack in two, right? They would try to use some physical simulation to literally crack the thing in two, and then they'd tweak the simulation of it and use these very sophisticated techniques, when really all you need is an uncracked object, and then it moves really quickly, and then you swap out two pieces instead of one, and now it's cracked in half. Right? So like for this, to me, I'm looking at them like, okay, it's drifting slowly, so already it feels kind of light. So that's just position.
Right.
It's distorting a little bit, okay, to kind of make it feel like a cloud. Now there's like 24 distortion effects in After Effects. The one they're using, I mean, it could be as simple as like a turbulent displace with like a really big size and a small amount, just kind of animating a little bit, and at the same time they're blurring it so it feels like it's dissipating. And that's basically it, I think. I think it's literally just moving it, distorting it, and blurring it. But so the net effect is it looks like a cloud, but it's really 3 simple techniques.
Right. I think that's a really good point that you bring up. I mean, it's always better to try to approach these things from the simplest level and to remember that the audience kind of wants to see it the way that you're trying to make it for the most part. I mean, I always think about effects on stage. Like, you know, you got that classic like wave effect on stage where you got like 2 things that are shaped like waves and they're just sort of moving them back and forth. And like, you just go with it on stage. You don't think that's a bad metaphor for water, or water doesn't move like that at all. You just sort of, you buy it. I don't know. So
yeah.
I think it's that kind of thing. So, yeah. But I think this is a great piece, and it brings us to our last piece that we're going to talk about today, which is from 2004. So this is like 2 years later, and we're going to talk about this really interesting kind of culty music video for this band Franz Ferdinand. That was a big like art rock kind of post-punk influenced art rock band back in the day, and it was directed by Jonas Odell, who's a Swedish filmmaker, I believe, who's directed a lot of music videos over the years. This was just like the second or third music video that he had made, but I think what's really cool about this is just how many references to different art styles that they mix in here. I mean, this kind of references Dadaism and Surrealism and Soviet propaganda posters and medical diagrams and maps and charts and all this crazy stuff, and even like old Hollywood musicals and maybe like Terry Gilliam animation. I mean, there's so many different things going on here, and I think of this kind of as the first real collage-inspired piece that I saw, which is something that's really inspirational to me in particular, but I think there was definitely a phase of like grungy collages after this piece came out. Do you think so, Joey?
Yeah, I actually kind of became obsessed with this style when this piece came out, and I would go go to the bookstore and you'd buy these books of like decoupage, like, elements you could buy, and they were meaningless. It was like, it would just be like a weird, like hyper realistic illustration of like a lobster, like for no reason, and you just use it because it looked cool, and it would say like figure 3 underneath it for no reason and stuff like that. I love this style, and I'm not as schooled in like the art history department as so like I can't really comment about. I mean, I didn't really know that all of those were the references. I just thought this is just like throwing the kitchen sink at it, yet somehow it works, and that's actually a lot harder to do than I think most people realize.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like all good design, I would say. It looks easy when you see somebody else doing it, but try to do it yourself and you realize how difficult this is. Believe it or not, I mean, I think there's some real restrained design work in here, even though it's a bit of a crazy mess, and sometimes he's filling the screen entirely. I think there's a lot of negative space that he reaches to, and I mean, it's not super minimal like the 6 Feet Under title sequence, but I think it bears comparing a little bit because they're both, a combination of live action and graphics, but the vision is completely different here. I mean, and I think they must have shot the studio in like a the band in a green screen studio or something, because they're doing that. They're dropping out the backgrounds on the bands and they're inserting them into a graphic world, which was still a little bit like, I mean, obviously people did that and people did that in movies and stuff, but in terms of music videos, that was also marked this as being a little bit different at the time, just how much of a graphic world that they inserted the band into. And then later, they actually turned the band into graphics, which is kind of crazy. And, like there were not a lot of plugins or any really at that time to help him do this like there are now, like Duick or Rubber Hose or things like that. And although I don't think actually Rubber Hose would work for this, but yeah, that kind of linking through parenting and rotation and anchor point animation is really hard. You get a lot of keyframes to make that kind of stuff look good. So this is not easy.
Yeah, from a technical perspective, this is a fairly complex piece of work, even today. I mean, there are some tools that, like you mentioned, Duick, that could make this a lot easier. So for anyone listening who doesn't know what that means, so there are parts in this video where the band basically become robots with, like a video head on top. And, you've got like, they're swaying back and forth and they're playing guitar and their feet are locked to the ground and things like that. And nowadays, the way you do that is you would build like a full character rig in After Effects, and there's a bunch of tools to help you do that. The 2 most popular are called Duick, D-U-I-K, and Rubber Hose. Now, Duick I don't know the exact year that it came out. I did some Googling, and the earliest mention of it I could find was like 2007. So it definitely wouldn't have been out by this time. And Rubber Hose is only a few years old, so it definitely wouldn't have helped.
Yeah.
And what that means is that they basically would have had to animate all these things the same way the students in this class are animating, the factory.
The robot arms.
Yeah, the robot arms. You're basically creating parenting chains, and you're using what's called forward kinematics, meaning you're rotating the joints one at a time to get them into the shape you want. If you use a tool like Duik, you can literally grab the hand and move it where you want, and the arm will follow it. It's called inverse kinematics. They didn't have that at the time. Another big thing, and this was really interesting to me, I didn't realize this till I was looking in the After Effects Wikipedia page. This version of After Effects, I think this was 2000, was this still 2002 or 2004? Yeah, so in 2004, the code name was Chambant. All right, but you actually did have Keylight included. I think the version right before this, they started including Keylight, which is a keying plugin that is really, really easy to use. And before they had Keylight, there was a built-in color keyer which was atrocious. It was awful. You could not get a good key with it. So you had to buy a third-party keyer like Primat, which was hundreds of dollars, or Ultimat. And I think you could buy Keylight, but then After Effects basically licensed it and started shipping it with After Effects. And all of a sudden, just with the built-in tools, without having to spend extra money, you could pull really good keys. And so I think it's interesting that the keys in this are actually pretty darn good. And of course, they're very affected. They affected the footage a lot to kind of cover up some of the sin, I'm sure.
And just in case you guys don't know, like Joey's talking about keying, he's talking about like dropping out a green screen background or something, or a blue screen they might have used back then. So
correct, yeah.
So usually you get these issues with the edges where the key meets the person. I mean, sort of where the background meets the person. Essentially, you get these really lousy edges, and that's a very common thing. And I think you're right. In this case, they threw so much like halftone over everything that it sort of doesn't matter. But otherwise. But, and if you didn't do it that way, they would have had to have cut it out, like rotoed each frame of the person out by hand, which would have made this even more of a difficult video to have made, I think.
Oh, it would have been awful.
I have a question for you, Joey. I've always wondered about this video. There's these shots of these kind of stretchy 3D boxes that intersect with each other. Do you know the shots that I'm talking about? They're like rectangle-y boxes, but they appear to be really 3D, like flat 3D layers.
Yeah.
I was wondering, do you think that he just made that the way that you and I would do that today? Just like kind of fitting together, like essentially rectangles into 3D space?
I think that's exactly what they did, but there's another layer to it if you look closely. So those boxes are essentially just 3D layers shaped into a 3D cube, and there's 3 of them. And even back then, you could pre-comp those boxes and turn on the collapse transformations button and basically have a 3D cube that you can stretch and play with in After Effects. But then what they did was they probably colored each side of that cube a little differently, and maybe did a color key, or they did some, like some alpha matting or luma matting, because the textures on those cubes don't stick to the cubes. You're actually like looking through, and it creates this weird effect. It's like when you watch it in real time, you probably don't even notice it. But if you go frame by frame through it, the texture is not sticking to the side of these cubes. Everyone listening is probably thinking, what the hell is he talking about? You have to go. Obviously, you need to have watched this to understand. But little choices like that, because it actually probably would have been easier to stick the texture to the cube than to do it the way they did it. But there's something weird and off-putting about it. And so it's an aesthetic choice that was made, and it looks really cool.
It really does. I think those shots were the ones more than anything else that I tried to puzzle out and figure out how he did that. And, everything else seemed sort of clear to me, but like that, I was just like, how the heck? Yeah. Even now, I mean, it's a combination of 2D elements in 3D space a lot. Those overhead shots of the band where they're kind of tracking and stuff. I assume that they used reference footage to kind of line that all up. But some of the 3D work there looks a little bit janky to me now. but I think they get away with it. And they also get away with a certain amount of jerkiness in the animation because they're dealing with like all these kind of like robot layers or whatever. But there's just a lot of linear animation happening even here, I feel like.
So without knowing the production process exactly, it's hard to say. There's a shot right at the beginning of the full band. The camera's kind of pulling out, and the floor clearly does not lock to their feet. And so there's two reasons that could happen. One is the physical camera was actually moving, which would mean that in order to track in a virtual environment around the band, you're going to need what's called a camera track. You're going to need to know exactly how that camera moved. So nowadays, After Effects ships with a 3D camera tracker, and it's one click, and it kind of analyzes your footage, and it gives you an After Effects camera that moved exactly the way the real camera did. It just tracks the whole scene. It does a bunch of math, figures it out. Well, that didn't exist back then. There was software that could do it, but you had to buy it. It was thousands of dollars, extremely technical, hard to use. I guarantee they didn't use that on this video.
Sure.
So more than likely, they faked it. So the camera was moving, and then they just kind of tried to get the After Effects camera to move the same way. And they got close, and it's close enough, good enough for government, as we would say. The other thing that I think may happen is that, there's this wiggliness to everything. Mm-hmm. So you did have expressions by this point. So it was possible, and actually even before expressions, there was a tool in After Effects called the Wiggler that you could use to it would have to make keyframes, but it could wiggle things for you.
I don't think these guys know what expressions are yet at all.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm going too fast here. Basically, expressions are just a form of code you can use in After Effects. So if you want something to move randomly, you can put an expression on it called wiggle, and it just makes it go randomly. Don't worry about that. That's maybe what they did, and that's why if you look at this shot of the band and the camera's pulling back, the floor is wiggling underneath them. So either it's not a good track or it's wiggling on purpose. But I thought it was interesting that nowadays doing 3D camera tracking and making a virtual environment for people is hundreds of times easier than it would have been back when this video came out.
I mean, there's so many things that I think are easier now that this could have, in ways that this could have been done. But I still think this would, even if you did this exact video now using current technologies, I think it would still be a ton of work to put this all together. There's a lot of shots in here. There's a lot of elements. And this is a long video, actually. It's like 4 minutes long, which for a music video is actually a lot to sustain over that 4 minutes, to kind of keep it fresh and to keep cutting to a new thing and keep finding a new scene. And I think they do a really good job of that. I think it's a real testament to Jonas O'Dell's directing, that it's, you're engaged the whole time, and that he doesn't repeat a lot of shots. A lot of music videos, I feel like toward the second half, you tune out because they're just sort of repeating the same sets. It's like a costume change maybe, and that's about it. But that was just a tremendous piece from 2004. And I think it's really interesting if we look at all of these pieces, together. What we have is, two really high-level title sequences that made huge splashes, and at the same time, we have these two more like cult pieces that kind of bubbled up and found their own audiences that also made a huge splash. And I think that's quite an important thing to remember about this time, sort of between 2001 and 2004, is that you could find success in motion graphics either way, I feel like, from the top or from the bottom. Yeah,
this was also kind of the beginning of the time period where After Effects artists started to get taken a little more seriously. Yes. We talked about it in the first episode, but there were the flame artists and there were the sort of the high-end post houses doing a lot of this stuff. But this Franz Ferdinand piece, I don't think it could have been done on a flame, but it would have been cost prohibitive, unless Franz Ferdinand knew somebody. Even back then when music video budgets were far higher than they are now, I don't think this video had $1 million budget, right?
No. But Domino Records, they're a small record label in England.
And so the one After Effects artist staying up for 2 weeks straight who has a clear vision and some design skills and knows After Effects can put this together for the price of After Effects. And that is something that all of the sudden in the zeitgeist started to bubble up during this time period where it's like, whoa, the work can be just as high end and frankly even cooler than what these the big boys on Flame are doing, because you're not limited by, okay, we can only afford 8 hours of your time. What can you do? It's
Right.
okay, we can throw a bunch of After Effects artists at this, and the app's getting sophisticated enough to pull off really high-end stuff.
Yeah, and people like Steven Spielberg are realizing that for the titles for big budget, huge projects like this. So
Yeah.
we've turned a corner here, definitely. It's gone from this little kind of thing that was not, this little compositing tool that just kind of did a couple of things and was, a cheap alternative to, oh, this is a real thing now. I see. Yeah, so this is an important time in the history of motion graphics.
Yeah, and in the next episode, I know we're going to start getting into, the capabilities of After Effects start to really take off, and you get into things like shape layers, which, seem very rudimentary, but actually completely changed the aesthetic of the industry when they came out. And basically it took After Effects to the level of, okay, now it's just required. You have to know After Effects.
I think that's probably a good place to leave it. That really, I think, sums it up. I think these are 4 awesome pieces that you guys should definitely know about and check out. And definitely watch the both versions of the 6 Feet Under, the director's cut and the network cut, or whatever you want to call it, because they're quite different, and it's really interesting to see the differences between them, I think.
Awesome.
So,
Until next time.
Right on. History of motion graphics. Thanks, Joey. Oh man, that was awesome. I think Joey and I are really hitting our stride here with this podcast. And also, more importantly probably, the work that we're discussing is just so good. And at this point, it's so seminal. Every piece we're talking about is super important here. And I assume that a few of you have already seen these pieces and maybe even took note of them when they were released. Okay, this isn't that long ago, relatively speaking. All 4 of these pieces were really huge influences on me personally, and I think I ripped off parts of these videos as best as I could for years. Each one of these was a big influence. All of these pieces still feel really fresh to me, and like I said up top, all of the talented people who made these are still pretty big players in the industry. Certainly Danny Yount and G-Monk and Jonas Odell are all pretty big. Kunzel and Degas, I'm actually not really sure what happened to them, but there you go. They're French. Strangely enough, I think that the weirdest person who made the weirdest piece here, and that's G-Monk, who I should say, his name is actually Bradley G. Monkowitz or something, so that's why he's called G-Monk. He's actually huge now, and he does big pieces, and he's kind of gone on to do the best of all these people. So, I'm going to suggest maybe you should take more acid before you make your next motion design piece. Or maybe not. Okay, folks, so thanks a lot for tuning in, and I will see you in the next podcast. Oh, and if you need me to work on turning your prunes into rhubarb, just let me know.